Hi, and welcome to Breaking Cycles with Maria, a podcast about life, relationships, emotional patterns, self awareness, and sometimes just recognizing that we're all human and still learning as we go. Some episodes are solo and educational, while others include guests and real conversations about relationships, work dynamics, personal growth, and the patterns we often don't even realize that we're carrying. But no matter the topic, there's always something that'll resonate with someone. A new perspective, a little insight, or maybe just that reminder that you're not alone in what you experience. So let's get started and let's navigate this beautiful, wild, adventurous thing called life together. Welcome back to Breaking Cycles with Maria, where we explore unhealthy relationship patterns, dysfunctional emotional systems, attachment wounds, communication breakdowns, personality patterns, and the psychological dynamics that shape how we live, love, and we relate to others. The goal of this podcast is not to label people, right? It's to build awareness, insight, and self understanding so that individuals can recognize unhealthy cycles, understand where patterns come from, and create healthier emotional systems moving forward. In part one of this series, we explored how narcissistic maternal dynamics shape the emotional blueprint of children overall, how early attachment patterns, emotional survival roles, approval seeking, guilt, hypervigilance, and identity adaptation quietly formed inside family systems. Then in part two, we focus specifically on daughters, how approval, comparison, emotional monitoring, visibility, and subtle competition often shape the mother-daughter relationship and later influence adult identity, relationships, boundaries, and self-worth. Today, we move into the mother-son pathway, and this dynamic is often very misunderstood because while daughters are frequently shaped through identity, approval, and emotional comparison, sons are often shaped through loyalty, emotional responsibility, guilt, enmeshment, and the pressure to remain emotionally connected in ways that can really quietly interfere with independence, adult relationships, and self definition later in life. Many men struggle deeply with these dynamics, but rarely have the language for them. And culturally, especially in many traditional immigrant or survival based family systems, these patterns are often normalized, they're encouraged, or they're actually even praised. The son is told, family comes first, your mother sacrificed everything for you, you should never upset your mother, you're the man of the house. Don't forget where you came from. Now, on the surface, some of these messages may sound loving, respectful, or culturally rooted. But when emotional loyalty becomes fused with guilt, obligation, emotional responsibility, or fear of separation, the relationship can quietly shift from healthy attachment into emotional enmeshment. And that distinction matters because emotional closeness is healthy. Emotional fusion is not. So today we're going to break it down. What mother-son enmeshment often looks like, how emotional loyalty systems develop, why some sons struggle with boundaries, independence, and adult relationships later in life, how guilt and emotional obligation quietly shapes identity, how culture can reinforce these patterns, and how these dynamics often continue into adulthood without either person fully realizing it. And just like the earlier episodes, this conversation is not about blaming the mothers. Most mothers in these systems were operating from their own trauma, their fears, losses, emotional deprivation, survival based environments, cultural pressure, and unmet emotional needs. This is about understanding the system because understanding creates awareness, and awareness is what allows cycles to finally begin changing. The mother son dynamic often becomes emotionally powerful because sons are frequently positioned very early around emotional responsibility and loyalty. In many family systems, especially emotionally overwhelmed systems, the son unconsciously becomes the protector, the emotional stabilizer, the good son. the emotional replacement for missing support, or the child responsible for reducing the mother's emotional pain. And most of the time, this is not directly spoken. The son is rarely told, "You are responsible for my emotional well being." Instead, what he learns is gradually through emotional experiences. He starts to notice his mother becomes emotionally distressed when he separates. Guilt appears when he prioritizes independence. Emotional closeness increases when he remains loyal. Tension increases when he develops autonomy. Approval is the strongest when emotional alignment is maintained. So, over time, the nervous system begins associating these connections with emotional responsibility. And that is where the loyalty blueprint begins forming. So, the son learns my role is to protect connection, my role is to prevent emotional pain, and my role is to stay emotionally available. My independence affects other people emotionally. And because these lessons often form early in childhood, they don't feel dysfunctional. They simply feel normal. Before we go further, it's important to understand what emotional enmeshment actually can look like in everyday life, because many people grow up with these dynamics and assume that they were completely normal. So, emotional enmeshment is not always loud, it's not controlling or even obvious. Sometimes it looks like excessive closeness without healthy emotional separation. Sometimes it looks like guilt, sometimes like obligation, sometimes emotional dependency, and sometimes it even looks like love. For example, a young boy wants to spend time with friends, but his mother responds emotionally with comments like, "You never spend time with me anymore. You've changed. I guess your friends are more important now." The child begins feeling emotionally guilty for normal independence. Or a teenage son wants privacy. He begins dating or starts becoming emotionally independent, and the parent responds with emotional withdrawal, sadness, maybe passive aggressive comments, or even guilt based messaging rather than supporting this healthy separation. Another common example is when a son becomes the emotional support system for the parent. The mother may vent to him about adult problems, loneliness, marriage issues, financial stress, or emotional pain in ways that place emotional weight on that child that he is not developmentally actually even prepared to carry. So the child unconsciously learns, my job is to keep her emotionally okay. And because these patterns develop gradually over time, many sons grow up believing emotional over responsibility is simply what love looks like. And during adolescence, this often becomes even more complicated. Adolescence is the developmental stage where teenagers are supposed to begin separating psychologically from their parents in healthy ways. They begin forming identity, independence, peer relationships, opinions, romantic interests, and emotional boundaries. But in emotionally enmeshed systems, this normal development process can quietly trigger emotional tension inside of the family. So, for example, a teenage son gets accepted into a college farther away. Instead of the excitement, the emotional atmosphere becomes very heavy. The mother may say, "So, you're really leaving me? What was the point of everything I sacrificed? I guess family doesn't matter anymore." Even if unintentionally, the emotional message becomes, "Your independence hurts me," or the teenage son begins prioritizing his girlfriend, sports, work, or future goals, and suddenly the parent becomes emotionally reactive, withdrawn, or guilt inducing. Over time, the son begins experiencing normal separation with anxiety and emotional conflict rather than confidence. And this is where many adults struggle with guilt, boundaries, emotional shutdown, divided loyalty, or relationship conflict actually begin. It's not in adulthood itself, but during the developmental years when individuality started feeling emotionally unsafe. Now, this is very important because people often confuse closeness with enmeshment. Healthy closeness allows connection, emotional support, individuality, boundaries, separation without guilt, and independence without punishment. In enmeshment, emotional boundaries become blurred. The child begins feeling emotionally responsible for the parent. The parent may rely excessively on the child emotionally, seek emotional regulation through the child, or unconsciously use guilt, obligation, emotional dependence, or loyalty pressure to maintain the closeness between them. And again, this is not always intentional manipulation. Sometimes it develops because the parent is emotionally lonely, sometimes because the marriage is emotionally disconnected, sometimes because of the abandonment wounds, sometimes because the child became the safest emotional attachment available for that parent. But regardless of intent, the impact on development can be very significant because children are not emotionally designed to regulate adult emotional needs. And when they do, adulthood often becomes emotionally confusing for them. Many sons in these systems begin adapting emotionally very early. Some become highly protective of their mother. Some become emotionally hyper aware of her moods. Some begin monitoring conflict in the home. Some become overly responsible. Some suppress their own emotions because they believe the mother already has too much stress. Others become emotionally fused with the idea that upsetting the mother equals betrayal. Over time, many sons can begin developing specific emotional roles inside of the family system. One son may become the emotional protector, constantly trying to reduce tension or prevent emotional pain. Another son may become the loyal rescuer, feeling responsible for helping, fixing, or emotionally stabilizing the mother. And another may become the guilt based caretaker, struggling to separate because emotional distance may feel selfish. Another may become emotionally avoidant, suppressing vulnerability because emotional closeness feels so overwhelming or emotionally consuming. These roles develop gradually through repeated emotional experiences. The son learns what increases closeness, what creates guilt, what creates emotional tension, what restores emotional harmony, and identity slowly beginning organizing around emotional loyalty. As the son enters adolescence, this is when identity formation naturally begins increasing. This is developmentally normal. Teenagers are supposed to separate psychologically from their mother and even their parents, develop individuality, build independence, form peer relationships, explore their identity, and create emotional boundaries. In healthy systems, this transition includes flexibility. But in emotionally enmeshed systems, adolescence often creates emotional tension because the son's growing independence may unconsciously feel threatening to the mother. As it begins, spending more time with peers, dating, building independence, forming opinions, creating boundaries, or wanting privacy, subtle emotional pressures may begin increasing. Not always directly, sometimes through comments like, "You don't spend time with me anymore. You've changed. You only care about your friends now. I guess I'm not important anymore. After everything I've done with you." The son often cannot fully explain why he feels conflicted, but internally, his nervous system actually begins associating independence with guilt. And this is where many boys begin splitting emotionally. Part of them wants autonomy, and part of them wants to feel responsible for preserving this emotional connection. So instead of asking, "Who am I becoming?" what happens is they start to quietly ask, "How independent can I safely become without emotionally hurting someone?" Then that internal conflict becomes extremely important later in adulthood. Many adult men shaped by these dynamics appear highly functional externally, but what may be happening is they may be responsible, hardworking, dependable, very family orientated, emotionally loyal, and protective. But internally, something else is going on. Many struggle with guilt around boundaries, difficulty disappointing others, emotional over responsibility, people pleasing, conflict avoidance. They may have fear of separation, divided loyalty in relationships, difficulty prioritizing partners over family systems, emotional shutdown under pressure. So some men become highly emotionally fused with the mother relationship. Others move toward emotional distance because closeness itself feels emotionally, it's too consuming, it's too much. And many fluctuate in between both. This is why some men struggle to fully separate emotionally, even when they are physically independent, because emotional independence and physical independence are not always the same thing. So, when the loyalty conflict appears, this is often when these patterns become very visible. Many men raised in these emotionally enmeshed systems generally love their partners, but internally they feel so trapped between loyalty to the mother, loyalty to the partner, the fear of conflict, of guilt, the fear of emotional rejection, or the fear of disappointing either side. And because these dynamics develop gradually over the years, the man often doesn't recognize the emotional conflict consciously. He simply experiences pressure. So the partner may feel emotionally secondary, unsupported, emotionally abandoned, confused by emotional passivity, hurt by loyalty conflicts. Meanwhile, the man often feels overwhelmed, emotionally trapped, guilty, anxious, and responsible for everyone else's emotions. This is why many couples repeatedly argue about boundaries without fully understanding the deeper emotional system underneath the real conflict. The issue often isn't simply, oh, it's the mother or the mother in law. The issue is the unresolved loyalty blueprint that exists. At this point, it's important to pause for a minute, and I want to recognize that these emotional patterns do not develop in isolation. Family systems are heavily shaped by culture, history, survival experiences, generational expectations, and the emotional environments people were raised within. And while I'm speaking openly about the Albanian community, because that is the culture that I come from and work closely with, these patterns are not unique to Albanians. We often see very similar dynamics across many immigrant, collectivist, survival based, and traditional cultures where loyalty, sacrifice, emotional endurance, and protecting the family image became deeply tied to survival and identity over generations. To fully understand these dynamics within the Albanian families, it is also important to briefly understand that historical and cultural contexts that shaped generations emotionally. For many Albanian families, especially those who lived through or were directly impacted by communist regime, survival, loyalty, image, obedience, and emotional suppression became deeply ingrained into their daily life. During that time, individuality, emotional vulnerability, disagreement, and personal expression were often unsafe. That was like a no. We didn't do things like this. Families learned to survive through control, silence, hypervigilance, sacrifice, and protecting the family image. That's what was important. Many people grew up fearing judgment, shame, exposure, or appearing emotionally weak or vulnerable. And while this conversation touches heavily on Albanian culture, many cultures, many traditions carry very similar emotional patterns shaped by hardship, instability, sacrifice, and generational survival. Emotional survival often became more important than emotional health. As a result, many children were raised with strong messages around loyalty, obligation, sacrifice, endurance, and protecting the family unit at all costs. Independence could sometimes be seen and interpreted as rejection, disrespectful, or abandoning family because family survival historically depended so heavily on emotional and structural closeness. This does not mean Albanian culture is unhealthy. In many ways, it is deeply loving, resilient, loyal, and family orientated, but like many cultures, shaped by survival, war, hardship, immigration, or oppression. Certain emotional patterns became normalized over generations. And unless those patterns are understood consciously, they often continue repeating automatically inside marriages, parenting, and family relationships. That historical context matters because many people are not simply reacting as individuals. They are often carrying emotional systems that were shaped way long before them. And part of the reason I'm speaking openly about culture in this series is because of the responses, messages, questions, and concerns I continue receiving online from people within the Albanian community. Many individuals are trying to understand behaviors, family dynamics, guilt, emotional pressure, and relationship struggles. They were never given language for growing up. So this conversation is not about criticizing culture. It's about raising the awareness and helping people better understand the emotional patterns that may still exist underneath many family systems today. Because when people finally understand what they've been experiencing, it often creates clarity, compassion, and the opportunity for healthier relationships moving forward. Now, culturally, this becomes even more complicated, especially in many immigrant survival based or traditional family systems, because many sons are heavily taught loyalty equals love, sacrifice equals respect, family obligations equals morality, and separation equals selfishness. And many mothers sacrificed enormously. That part is real. Many parents survived war, they survived immigration, poverty, instability, comfort. They worked endlessly and they carried emotional burdens silently. So sons generally feel deep gratitude and emotional responsibility. But gratitude and enmeshment are not the same thing, and the distinction is extremely important. Healthy adult relationships require boundaries, emotional differentiation, independent identity, reciprocal partnership, emotional flexibility. Because without those things, the son may remain emotionally divided between adulthood and emotional obligation. And this is where many adult relationships begin struggling. So here's a scenario. This is the son who cannot say no. An adult son wants to spend the holidays with his wife and children independently for the first time. The mother responds emotionally, "So now your wife comes before your family. I guess mothers get forgotten. I sacrificed everything for you." So the son immediately feels guilty and anxiety. Even though his request is actually developmentally normal, his nervous system experiences it as it's emotional betrayal that he's doing. Instead of setting a healthy boundary calmly, he may over explain, avoid the conversation entirely, or become resentful internally while still complying externally. So, what happens over time, this creates emotional strain inside the marriage because the partner often feels the relationship never fully becomes its own emotional unit away from the mother. Here's a scenario for the emotional replacement dynamic. So, in some family systems, especially where the parental marriage was emotionally disconnected, the son unconsciously becomes the primary emotional support for the mother. The mother may frequently vent to him about being lonely, disappointment, relationship struggles, or emotional pain far beyond what is developmentally appropriate. So the son learns at a very early age, my role is to make sure that she's okay, meaning my role is to make sure that my mother is always okay. As an adult, he may feel emotionally drained in close relationships because emotional closeness automatically activates responsibility rather than the mindset of a give and take relationship, one that's actually balance. Some men in this position become emotionally avoidant later in life, not because they don't care, but because closeness unconsciously feels emotionally consuming. It's too much, it's overwhelming. Another scenario is this is the son who never fully separates. So some men become highly successful professionally, yet remain emotionally dependent within the family system. The mother may still have heavily influence on decisions, relationships, parenting, finance, emotional reactions, and even conflict resolutions. So the adult son may struggle trusting his own judgment without maternal approval. Partners often describe feeling like there are three people in the relationship or three people in the marriage inside the relationship emotionally. That does not mean the man is weak. It often means emotional differentiation was never fully developed because guilt and loyalty remained fused together. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some real life scenarios. Here's one. This is the emotional protector. So a young boy notices his mother's crying after arguments with his father. And she says, "You're the only one who understands me." And the child confronts her. Over time, he becomes emotionally hyper aware of her distress. As an adult, he later feels overwhelming guilt whenever his partner expresses concerns about boundaries with his mother. Internally, his system experiences the situation as if I create distance, I'm hurting her, even when healthy boundaries are necessary. And then we have the guilt around independence son. Here's a teenage son that begins spending more time with his friends or with his girlfriend. The mother says to him, "I barely see you anymore. You used to care more about the family. You're forgetting where you came from." So the comments may sound subtle, but emotionally, the son begins associating autonomy with guilt. And then as an adult, he may be struggling making independent decisions without excessive reassurance or emotional conflict. And then we have the divided husband. So here's a married man repeatedly who avoids setting boundaries with his mother. His wife feels emotionally unsupported. Arguments increase, the husband becomes emotionally overwhelmed, and he withdraws. Not because he doesn't love his wife, but because internally he feels trapped between preserving the peace, avoiding the guilt, and protecting his mother emotionally and protecting his marriage at the same time. So his nervous system experiences boundaries as emotional danger rather than a healthy differentiation. And then we have the emotional suppression in men. So some sons respond differently. Instead of becoming emotionally fused, they emotionally shut down because emotional closeness feels so overwhelming or emotionally consuming growing up. As adults, they may avoid vulnerability, struggle expressing emotions, emotionally detach during conflict, become avoidant in relationships, prioritize work or independence excessively. And that's not because they lack emotions, but because emotional closeness unconsciously feels connected to pressure, responsibility, or emotional engulfment. Now, this is extremely important. Not every close mother son relationship is unhealthy, okay? Not every protective mother is a narcissist. Not every loyal son is enmeshed. And not every family dynamic means someone has a personality disorder. These patterns exist on a spectrum. The issue is not closeness. The issue is whether individuality, boundaries, emotional separation, and adult identity are emotionally allowed without guilt, punishment, emotional withdrawal, or loyalty conflict. That is the difference. Many men spend years believing that their anxiety, their guilt, their passivity, conflict avoidances, or difficulty setting boundaries means that they are weak, indecisive, or emotionally flawed, when in reality, many of these patterns are learned emotional survival strategies. Their nervous system adapted around preserving connection, and adaptation is not identity. Once these dynamics are recognized, many men begin learning something new, that boundaries do not require betrayal, that independence does not equal abandonment, that adulthood does not require emotional disconnection. and that healthy relationships can include both love and boundaries together. That shift is incredibly important because many men spend years trapped between guilt and resentment without understanding why. And often at times because men are supposed to be the stronger ones. If parts of today's conversation felt familiar, I want you to remember something. Understanding these patterns is not about blaming parents. I'm one that I don't like to blame people, and most people think that I make excuses. I don't. Understanding behavior doesn't excuse the harm. It's about understanding emotional systems. Many parents were operating from survival, trauma, fear, emotional deprivation, cultural pressure, or unmet emotional needs they themselves never had language for. But understanding the system matters because what remains unconscious often continues repeating, and what becomes understood finally has the opportunity to change. So many sons raised in these environments adapted by becoming emotionally responsible, hyper loyal, conflict avoidant, emotionally shut down, or deeply guilt orientated, not because something was wrong with them, but because those strategies once helped preserve connection. But adulthood requires something different. It requires learning how to maintain love without losing individuality, how to create boundaries without excessive guilt, how to build partnerships without divided emotional loyalty, and how to separate emotionally without believing separation means abandonment. That is the real work of differentiation. In the next episode, we'll begin exploring how these early blueprints often continue showing up inside adult romantic relationships, including conflict patterns, attachment anxiety, emotional withdrawal, people pleasing, emotional overfunctioning, and the unconscious way childhood survival roles continue shaping adult love. Because the blueprint rarely stays inside the original family, it usually follows people into adulthood until it's finally recognized. This is Breaking Cycles with Maria, and I'll see you in the next episode.